Everyone, I'm Laura Terhune. I'm the CEO of the Midlothian Chamber of Commerce. Welcome to our 2020 Legislative Series. We are really glad you've joined us today. The Chamber's Legislative Committee has worked hard to create informative sessions that highlight our country, state, and national issues. And the 2020 series will officially be the best on record. The chair of our committee, Ross Weaver, will be assisting me in facilitating today's meeting. Ross is the Executive Vice President for Town Square Title. He's a third-generation resident of Midlothian who has served on the community on the Planning and Zoning Commission for the city from 2012 to 2020, including a stint as the chair. If you have questions for the senator, please submit those to Ross and me in the chat box. Please keep those related to economic and business unless we run out of topics and then we need to move on to other things. Most of our attendees today are local business professionals. You'll be interested to know that Mr. Cruz is extremely supportive of chambers of commerce because he understands and wants to help local businesses as we do. I've been a chamber professional for 25 years in some great cities around this state, and in those years, only Senator Cruz has provided a real liaison to the communities like he has with our friends Michael Flushy and Christine Babcock in his Dallas office. With that being said, let me begin with this introduction of our senator. Ted Cruz often states that he has fought for limited government, economic growth, and the Constitution. His mother, Eleanor, was born in Delaware to an Irish and Italian working family. She became the first in her family to go to college, graduated from Rice University with a degree in mathematics, and became a pioneering computer programmer in the 1950s. You've already heard Ted's father, Rafael Cruz, told us his story. After being tortured and imprisoned in Cuba, he fled to the United States, where he attended the University of Texas at Austin in 1957. He then started a small business in the oil and gas industry. Today, Ted's father is a pastor in Dallas. Growing up, his father would often say to Ted, "When we faced oppression in Cuba, I had a place to flee to. If we lose our freedom here, where do we go?" As Solicitor General for the state of Texas and in private practice, Ted authored more than 80 US Supreme Court briefs and argued 43 oral arguments, including 9 before the US Supreme Court. In the US Senate, records will indicate that Ted has led the efforts to repeal Obamacare, to secure the border, and to confirm qualified justices to the Supreme Court. He has also fought to defend life, marriage, and our Bill of Rights. Ted says that he, his wife, and their 2 daughters, Caroline and Catherine, and their families have been blessed to live the American dream, the idea that anyone through hard work and determination can achieve anything. And he is committed to ensuring every family has that same opportunity. It is my high honor and distinct pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Senator Ted Cruz.
Well, thank you very much. It's great to be with you. Thank you for having me. Thank you for having my dad on as well. And I wish we could be with you in person. But these are strange times we're in, and so with the blessing of virtual connection, we can be a long way away and yet right on each other, in each other's living rooms and on each other's computers. So it's great to be with you. These are remarkable and extraordinary times we find ourselves in. Our country faces 2 simultaneous crises. We have a global pandemic with the coronavirus. It is serious. We've seen hundreds of thousands of people lose their lives all over the world and here in the United States. We've seen over 12,000 people lose their lives here in the state of Texas. And collectively, we have taken serious and extraordinary steps to fight this disease, to limit the spread of the virus, and to protect people and keep people safe. At the same time, we are facing an economic crisis, a catastrophe of staggering scale. In the last several months, over 51 million Americans have lost their jobs. That is a greater economic disaster than anything we have witnessed in our lifetimes. The last time this country saw something comparable was the Great Depression. And I believe the #1 economic priority right now today has to be restarting the economy, getting Texans back to work. I have been this week engaged in a teletour all across the state of Texas, visiting with chambers of commerce, visiting with business leaders in East Texas and West Texas and North Texas and South Texas, the entire state. And there's a consistency to what you hear from Texans. Texans want to go back to work. Texans want small businesses to reopen. The men and women who are on this call want to reopen their businesses, and people want to go back to work to provide for their families. And I think that needs to be our priority, is government policies that make it possible for businesses to reopen, for the economy to get moving. And we can do it in a way that's smart. We can do it in a way that recognizes common sense and sound science. And so we can use reasonable steps to slow the spread of the disease and keep people safe. But we need to reopen the economy and get Texans back to work. And on the economic front, that is my number one priority right now. With that, why don't we open it up to questions and have a discussion about those issues and any others you like.
All right. Ross, you want to start us off with questions?
Absolutely, Laura. Thank you. Senator Cruz, it's a pleasure to have you. We consider it a very big honor for you to join us at the Midlothian Chamber of Commerce to talk about success and opportunities. One of the hot topics right now that relates to economic vibrancy for our great nation is the proposed adverse market refinance fee that Fannie and Freddie are putting in place to add 50 basis points to any cash out or non-cash out refinance at a time when a lot of Americans are trying to trim their budgets down and reduce their out-of-pocket expenses. Should we be putting hurdles in the way of refinancing at a low interest rate right now, and how do we avoid that?
Well, Ross, that's a very good question, and I'm going to confess you started me off on a question that I have not examined closely. So I certainly have been actively involved in trying to ease the availability of credit and liquidity for families, for small businesses, for employers in a time of crisis. And I think that also includes the ability to refinance your home. And so the specific point you raised about the Fannie and Freddie fee that is being contemplated or imposed, I haven't examined that question, but what I'm going to do is my policy team is on this call, and I'm going to ask them to follow up with you, and we're going to look at it. Just reacting to it on principle, I would be pretty skeptical of why you would want to impose an additional fee at a time that people ought to be able to access the equity in their home and have additional liquidity. But as I said, I'm happy to examine it more closely and get back to you on that.
Thank you, Senator. I think that's a very valid point. A lot of small businesses, especially in rural America or suburban America, start or rely upon being able to access that credit in their home in a time of crisis. And I think that is something that is near and dear to a lot of our small business and self-proprietors. The next question that we had was, how do we get our small businesses on Main Street back to work? I mean, everybody's talking about we need to do this. We need to balance safety. We need to balance economics. What role can the federal government play in stimulating and paving the way for that to occur?
So it's a great question, and there are a lot of different pieces to it. Let's look first backwards and then forwards. Looking backwards, when this coronavirus pandemic hit, we saw several months ago, we saw Congress come together with enormous bipartisan agreement and pass a whole series of legislative measures, the biggest of which, as you know, was the CARES Act. The CARES Act has been referred to by some as stimulus legislation. I actually don't think it was designed to be stimulus legislation. Its purpose was not to stimulate the economy. Rather, it was relief legislation. It was designed to provide short-term emergency loans to individuals and families and small businesses that were struggling at the height of the crisis. And we saw overwhelming bipartisan agreement on it. It passed the Senate 96-0. I voted for it, and Bernie Sanders voted for it. That's a lot of ideological diversity. Where we are today is a very different place. What I believe our focus should be on now is recovery. And indeed, I've introduced legislation called the Recovery Act that is focused on exactly what you just asked about. How do we help the millions of small businesses across the country that are just now reopening their doors? How do we help them to survive and grow and prosper and thrive and hire people back? And I think the most effective levers are reducing tax burdens, reducing regulatory burdens. And so the Recovery Act that I've introduced would suspend the payroll tax for the remainder of the year. That ends up meaning for employers, their cost of rehiring employees goes down. And for employees, they get an immediate pay raise. And so that's an immediate pro-growth injection of tax relief into the job market. The Recovery Act also has a suspension of the income tax for the next $10,000 that everyone earns in the year of 2020. Again, that's a pro-growth incentive. It's a work incentive for people to go back to work, that they have an additional incentive to do so. Another part of the Recovery Act is focused on testing. One of the barriers to people going back to work is they're afraid for safety. My legislation creates a federal tax credit for employers to test their employees, to provide COVID tests on a periodic, regular basis so that people going back to work can have a confidence that they're safe. I think leaning in on testing is one of the important pieces of restarting our economy. Another important element of it is limiting liability. One thing that concerns me greatly is that every small business, every restaurant, every movie theater, every school, every institution that reopens, if somebody gets sick, if an employee gets sick, if a customer gets sick, you're going to be sued. You're going to be sued, and we're going to face a tidal wave of litigation. And so the Recovery Act has a safe harbor to protect small businesses that reopen, institutions that reopen. It's not your fault. There's this global pandemic that came from Wuhan, China. And we don't want to create a massive disincentive for businesses to reopen. And so I think providing a safe harbor makes a lot of sense. That's what I think our focus needs to be on, is helping people get back to work, helping Texans go back and provide for their families.
Thank you, Senator Cruz. I think the concept of a safe harbor from some of the civil liabilities is a huge concern and would be a major relief to many small business owners who don't have teams of litigators on retainer ready to defend themselves like the Fortune 500 companies are blessed to have.
And chambers of commerce too, because we host events.
Yep.
And we don't want somebody saying they got sick at a luncheon or a ribbon cutting. Sure. It could break a small organization.
Yep.
Absolutely. We did have a good question from one of our attendees in the chat that I want to get to, related to what steps are you proposing, and do you think Congress and the federal government can put in place to provide some relief to the rising cost of insurance as it relates to small business owners and many of the regulations under Obamacare? How do we begin to balance the cost to the employer and the ability to maintain an ongoing concern versus the rights of the employed under healthcare benefits?
Well, it's a great question, and as you know, there's no one in the Senate who has fought harder against Obamacare than I have. I think Obamacare has done enormous damage to the country in many, many respects. It's done enormous damage to the practice of medicine, but it's the biggest area where people have been harmed is exactly what this question is, which is that insurance premiums have skyrocketed. When Barack Obama proposed Obamacare, he promised that the average family's health insurance premiums would drop $2,500 a year. Now, if that had actually happened, I think there's a real possibility that people would be much more fine with Obamacare than they are today. What in fact happened is not only did that not come to pass, but the average family's premiums have increased over $5,000 a year under Obamacare. And I think the priority ought to be lowering the cost of premiums, making health insurance more affordable. And how do you do it? Look, Economics 101, if you want prices to go down, you want more choices, you want more competition, you want more options. What does Obamacare do? Fewer choices, less competition, less options, and it drives the premiums through the roof. And that has hurt a lot of Texans, a lot of Americans. In 2017, I led the fight to try to deliver on our promise to repeal Obamacare. And you'll recall we came just one vote short when my colleague John McCain at 1 a.m. famously stuck his thumb down and killed the effort. That was a frustrating and maddening moment. I will say, though, that we did have a major victory that same year where we repealed the Obamacare individual mandate. So that was part of the Obamacare system. I led the fight on that. None of the observers thought we could get it done, and we did get it done. The Obamacare individual mandate, every year about 6 million Americans got fined by the IRS because they couldn't afford health insurance. And of those, roughly 80% earned $50,000 a year or less, roughly 40% earned $25,000 a year or less. And so it was unjust, it was unfair. A single mom working 2 jobs, not even making $25,000 a year, who couldn't afford health insurance, the IRS would come and fine her to add insult to injury because she couldn't afford health insurance. It didn't make any sense. We succeeded in repealing that. What I have been pressing for, and I've introduced multiple pieces of legislation in this regard, is allowing competition in health insurance, allowing more choices, more competition, drive prices down. And I'll tell you, an important part of the Recovery Act that goes right to this is expanding the use of health savings accounts, HSAs, which are tax-advantaged ways to save for healthcare. Right now, federal law limits HSAs that you can only have a health savings account if you have a high deductible health insurance plan, which means most Americans, it's illegal for you to have an HSA. I think that's really stupid. And so I've introduced both standalone legislation and legislation as part of the Recovery Act to allow every American to have an HSA, to allow you to save in a tax-advantaged way for healthcare needs. That helps lower the cost of healthcare for everyone. And reforms like that, I think we ought to be leaning in vigorously on right now.
And Ross, if you don't mind, I've got a related question.
Go for it.
I have heard that there's discussion of associations like Chambers of Commerce being able to form a group where you could offer health insurance to your members, and that the group then has the cost benefit savings from a larger pool. Where is that, and what's your position on that?
So that's exactly right. Those are called association health plans, and they're opportunities for groups of individuals, groups of small businesses to come together. You know, if you look at our health insurance market, it works pretty well for large employers. It's the smaller employees that employers that don't have the economies of scale, don't have the buying power, where you really see the damage, and also the individual market. So sole proprietors, if you're out purchasing insurance and not an employee of a big company, that's where really many of the problems are found. Association health plans are a terrific solution. I've introduced legislation to expand their use. And it's just like you described. They enable people to come together, either chambers of commerce to come together, or any group or association. You can have, you could have an association of plumbers in the state of Texas come together and enable a bunch of individual small businesses to get those larger economies of scale, those lower premiums. Obamacare stands in the way of that. It prevents that kind of market flexibility. And so I think that's a very positive reform.
Well, good luck. That would help us a lot.
Yeah.
So a question that's on a lot of our both employers and employee minds right now is, how do I go back to work once we reopen this economy if I'm not sure my kids are going to be able to go back to school? I know this is a state level issue. I know this is a local level issue, but we do have a Department of Education at the federal level. So what can be done to provide leadership, umbrella, and guidance there for our local and state leaders as we move forward?
Yeah, it's a great question. Listen, I think we need to have our kids back in school. I think it is. And listen, I'm sitting here right now in my living room at home. I have been working from my living room for an awful lot of the last 6 months. Upstairs, my wife Heidi is in her office. She's working from there. Our daughter Catherine, who's in 3rd grade, is in her bedroom right now doing distance learning on the computer. Our daughter Caroline, who is in 7th grade, actually Catherine's in 4th grade. I think I said 3rd. She just moved to 4th. Caroline, who's in 7th, actually today is at a friend's house doing distance learning. But we have had, for months, the 4 of us in this house, all on top of each other, working and doing school via computer. the problem is, look, it's been hard for us with Heidi and me both being able to work from home, being able to help our girls. It's been hard for schooling to be effective, even in that context where we're blessed to have some advantages. I can't imagine how difficult it must be for a single mom who's struggling to hold on, who has 2, 3, 4, 5 kids at home, to try to get them to do distance learning when she doesn't have any help or assistance and it's just her. And the tragedy of that is for many months now, we've had a whole lot of kids in Texas and across the country who are just falling behind, who are not learning what they should be in school, who aren't learning reading and writing and arithmetic. And it's one thing if that's the case for a couple of weeks. Remember at the beginning of this, everyone said we're going to flatten the curve just for a couple of weeks. It's one thing for kids to miss school for a couple of weeks. We're now looking at month after month after month. And as that extends, we are looking at a whole generation of kids that are at risk of being left behind. That we shouldn't be okay with that. We shouldn't be willing to accept that. So I think it's really important that kids go back to school. Now, schools can engage in reasonable steps to stop the spread of COVID and social distancing, rearranging the school so that the risks are lower. I think that makes sense. Now, we do know that the COVID's impacts are not uniformly distributed across the population. There are those who are particularly vulnerable, those who are very elderly, those who have serious health conditions that have had much worse experiences with COVID. I think it makes sense for those who are older, those who have serious health issues, to be isolated and to try to limit their contact while this disease is spreading. But for younger, healthier people, the fatality rates are much, much, much lower. For kids, the fatality rates are nearly zero. Kids can get it, and kids, frankly, the risk with kids is greater that they get it and transmit it to an adult who is more vulnerable, rather than, for whatever reason, this virus has not been particularly damaging to children. But one thing to keep in mind, whether it is schools or whether it is shutting down the economy, is there are enormous public health consequences to shutting everything down. When the economy shuts down, if people are broke and alone, we know and we're already seeing increased rates of mental illness, increased rates of depression, increased rates of domestic violence, increased rates of substance abuse, of alcohol abuse. All of those are costing lives. And so sometimes people frame it as sort of a simple trade-off. We've got to save lives, shut everything down. Well, shutting everything down costs an awful lot of lives as well. And so we need to have a reasonable balance. I don't think we should treat this as a partisan political matter or as a topic for zealotry. We ought to engage in some common sense. And one of the common sense principles is kids ought to be back in school. We shouldn't be okay with kids not receiving the education they need to succeed in life. And so we ought to, and on the federal government, we ought to be encouraging that. The Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos, she is a good friend. I know her well. I work with her and talk with her frequently. The federal government is trying to encourage school districts to open up. The state is trying to encourage school districts to open up, but it varies district by district and school by school what rules they're following. I'll tell you, I've done several Zoom calls with presidents of colleges and universities in Texas that are opening up. And so their college students are by and large coming back, and they're trying to be creative, and they're engaged in some social distancing, and sometimes they're doing a combination of some in person and some virtual. All of those are reasonable discussions to have, but I think just shutting down the schools in perpetuity is a really, really bad idea.
Thank you, sir. We appreciate your insights on that topic. We did receive one additional question through our chat that is related to the FAST Act, which I believe is set to expire at the end of or during 2020. Is there any headwinds in the Senate to renew or extend or revitalize that program going forward after the end of this year?
So I don't think you'll see anything move in 2020. I think going forward, the FAST Act and infrastructure investment and transportation, I think that's a priority. It's a responsibility of the federal government to invest in it. And there is bipartisan interest in doing so. I think a lot of Republicans and some Democrats want to see additional infrastructure investment. I know the president does. I've discussed it with him many times. I will tell you, right, between now and Election Day, you're not going to see much of anything past Congress. Right now, we're 2 months out from an election, and we're kind of in the silly season. I do not think there is any possibility of seeing Democrats in the House or in the Senate being willing to work with Republicans to accomplish anything right now. But hopefully we get past this election. I'm hoping that it is a good election and that the president is reelected and that Republicans keep control of the Senate and retake control of the House. If that happens, I think there's a good chance that you'll see a major infrastructure bill move next year. But right now, with the partisan division and dysfunction, there's zero chance that it happens between now and Election Day.
Thanks, sir. One quick question, and then Laura's giving me what she calls the final question. So I'm sneaking in here with one more of my own. How do we encourage and leverage American exceptionalism and ingenuity to plan for handling the next crisis better? Because the reaction this time of, hey, let's just spend our way out of it and hide at home, how do we avoid that next time, and how do we leverage the average American in preparing for that?
Look, it is a great question. Let me answer it a couple of different ways. One, I do think coming out of this crisis, there have been some beneficial aspects. We've learned to use technology more effectively, things like Zoom calls like this. I suspect 6 months ago, most of us hadn't done a Zoom call. We've now probably done more today than we'd done in our whole life before this pandemic. Mm-hmm. That's a useful tool. That's a useful tool for leveraging communication and commerce and making us more efficient. We've also seen improvements in things like telemedicine, the ability of high quality physicians to be able to access people, sometimes people in isolated rural areas. And I think those improvements have been beneficial. Even the distance learning, there are a lot of problems with it, but there are some benefits to distance learning. And so our school system, both K through 12 and universities, were sort of forced almost immediately to try to figure this out. I think that learning, all of which will be beneficial, and we will gain some benefits going forward. We've also seen government lifting regulations in the course of this crisis. I've introduced legislation that says every state and federal regulation that was lifted during the crisis, the presumption ought to be that it remains lifted going forward, that if it was helpful to lift the regulation during the crisis, then it ought to be helpful to keep it lifted during the recovery. So there are a lot of benefits from that. And I'll also say personally, I know a lot of people have experienced what my family's experienced, which is the time we've spent together as a family has been an incredible and precious gift from God. I mean, to be honest, if I were to think of like anything our family needed and our kids needed, I could not have imagined a prescription of cancel every meeting, cancel every plane flight, cancel every dinner, cancel every play date, clear the calendar and put all of the family in one house 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Like we never would have done that. And yet that's what happened. And it's been a blessing personally on the family side. And I've talked to a lot of people who've expressed similar sentiments. That being said, all of that being said, there are a lot of lessons to be learned that we ought to ask during this crisis and after this crisis. How to be more prepared for a pandemic. That is certainly, this is not the last pandemic that America will face, either naturally occurring or as a tool of bio warfare or bioterror. And so preparing for that, we need to have very serious discussions. But you're right, I do think policymakers vastly underestimated the costs of a shutdown, that it was frankly sold to the American people under false pretenses. It was told it'd just be 2 weeks. And then it dragged on weeks after weeks and months after months, and people's entire life savings and businesses were destroyed. And I think the policymakers grossly underestimated the harms from that. You know, when I was in college and law school, I studied economics quite a bit. There's a school of economics called public choice theory. And one of the things it discusses is how in evaluating choices in a democratic society, concentrated visible harms are overvalued compared to diffuse, less visible harms. And in this crisis, that plays out very directly, where you can see front and center the people dying from COVID-19, which is truly tragic, but the millions being hurt by the economic steps being taken by government, those harms are undervalued in the assessment. And I think going forward, I hope policymakers, I hope all of us learn from that going forward and handle the next crisis in a more intelligent and a wiser way.
Thanks, sir. Final question. If you had the fiat power to bring one issue before Congress to ensure it gets front and center stage, what would that issue be?
School choice. I am a passionate advocate for school choice. I think it's the civil rights issue of the 21st century. I've been fighting for school choice for decades. And in fact, the biggest legislative victory that I've ever won in Congress was in 2017 as part of the tax cut bill. I introduced an amendment that expanded College 529 savings plans. Tax advantage plans used to be just directed towards college. My amendment expanded it to K through 12 education so that parents all across Texas, all across the country can save and spend up to $10,000 per year per child in a tax advantage savings account to help them choose the best school for their kid, whether public or private or parochial, to put you, the parent, and put the kids in charge. That ended up passing. It passed on the Senate floor. It was a 50-50 vote at 1 a.m. And the vice president had to come down to the Senate to break the tie, pass it into law. And it was the most far-reaching federal school choice legislation that has ever passed. One element of the Recovery Act that I'm fighting for right now is legislation that I've introduced that would create a federal tax credit, $5 billion a year, so $50 billion over 10 years, a dollar-for-dollar matching tax credit to individuals or businesses who contribute to scholarship granting organizations giving scholarships to K through 12 education. And that would provide tremendous opportunities right now for parents whose kids are at home, and if the school isn't meeting, would give scholarships so that kids could get education. And that is an issue I'm fighting for. It's an issue I'm working very closely with the president on, but I think it is profoundly important because education is so foundational to everything else, that everything I can do to push it forward, I have done and will keep doing. And if you gave me a magic button to push, I would definitely push the button.
Thank you very much, Senator Cruz. We greatly appreciate your time in joining us today. It's when we started this Legislative Affairs Committee several years ago, I really never thought we would have enough momentum to have a sitting U.S. Senator join us for one of our legislative updates. So it's an honor to have you here. And we can't thank you enough. And with that, I will turn it back over to Laura to close out the meeting.
Yes, Senator, it has been a pleasure to have you online. Thank you for serving the citizens of this state and of Ellis County area. It's been an honor to have you on.
Well,
for
Laura,
everyone.
Thank you both. Let me just make one final point as we're wrapping up, which is just a word of hope and encouragement to everyone. We're going to make it through these challenges. These challenges are enormous. It's easy to be dispirited or demoralized, but Texans are strong and resilient. Americans are strong and resilient. And we have made it through enormous challenges before. We've made it through 2 world wars, a civil war. We made it through 9/11. We made it through the Great Depression. We made it through pandemics before. And we will make it through this the same way we always have, by coming together, by standing as one, by standing for the principles and values that built this great nation. So I just want to thank everyone in Midlothian, everyone who's part of the chamber, for your leadership, the leadership that you're providing in your businesses, the leadership you're providing with your employees and your coworkers, the leadership you're providing with your family and your community. It makes a huge difference. You're playing a big part in helping us get through this challenge. And I am honored to be standing with you as we work together to move to brighter days ahead.
Well, we will continue to do our best, and we appreciate your help in serving the businesses in our community and in the state.
Thank you. God bless.
Thank you. So to everyone watching today, we hope you'll join us tomorrow for our final program of the 2020 legislative series. We'll celebrate the service of State Representative John Ray, who is retiring from that position, and we will get to know candidate Jake Elsie, who is presumed to be our state representative, which will be finalized in November. As I said earlier this month, we heard from County Judge Todd Little and Congressman Ron Wright. You can find those webinars on our website, which is midlothianchamber.org. Read our weekly e-blast and check the Chamber's calendar for other upcoming events. Everyone, have a great day, and thank you for joining us.